That goes.
Okay. Hello, everybody. We are back with another week talking about the Philadelphia Flyers. I'm joined with 97.3 Flyers insider Kevin Durso. So I think we should start off with Coots. This yesterday was the second game that Sean Couturier was a healthy scratch, despite being named the Philadelphia Flyers captain. What do you think is the reasoning behind this? And do you think it's had an effect on this team at all?
Um, a couple different ways to go with that. So, I mean, it's definitely had an effect on the team, and probably in the positive way that John
Mhm.
Tortorella was hoping for, because they've played two of their better games lately since it happened. Um, what's the meaning behind it or the reasoning behind it? We probably know about as much as anybody else
Mm,
does. I think the reason is in John Tortorella's mind only, and everybody else is left to guess. I mean, even Sean Couturier couldn't really offer much information on that one. So, for now, the reason seems to be, I mean, you can deduct a couple different parts of the reason. He has struggled offensively. He has one goal over 27 games. That's not a lot, obviously. That's not a successful offensive season. It doesn't mean that he's playing as poorly as one goal over that length of time. He obviously they rely on him way more for defensive level play and things like that. And
mm,
overall, like, most of his advanced numbers are pretty solid as well. He's good in the face-off circle. He's, obviously he's relied on defensively, but also, the team in general over the course of the last several games had given up a lot of goals, and he was on the hook for a good amount of them in terms of just being on the ice. I think I had heard over the course of that stretch of games, he had one goal, 7 assists, and was a minus
mhm,
16. It's so that adds up pretty quickly, and it does start to put eyes on you. For the most part, I think the biggest reason we're even talking about this is because he is the captain, and this
mhm,
just doesn't happen. You don't see a captain usually out of the lineup unless there's an injury involved, there's something. And to an extent, I guess, like, you could kind of say there is, to a degree, because this is also what happens when he hadn't played in 2 years. He comes back, he
mhm,
plays 20 minutes a night for the first half of the season, looks pretty good doing it, and then it seems like he's hit a wall a little bit. And that was kind of bound to happen with him. I also just don't know, the the interesting part of the whole scratching thing is the alternative really any better?
mhm,
Especially looking at the second game. The first game, there was obviously some clear balance with the lines. They got guys in that they felt like were going to make a difference, even if on paper that probably wasn't the best lineup. I went back and looked at just specifically the Carolina game, the second one that he was scratched for, and Nick Deslauriers didn't even play 4 minutes in the game.
mhm,
That kind of is an indication to me that maybe there's room for Couturier to get back in sometime soon, because to me, the difference between playing Sean Couturier even for 10 minutes and letting him work this out and giving him some instruction of what more you want to see from him is better than 4 minutes of Nick Deslauriers and playing 11 forwards for the most part,
mhm,
especially considering that it wasn't like Deslauriers didn't get time because of one thing or another. He didn't fight in the game or something like that takes him off the ice. He just played 4 minutes, and that was it. So I don't understand sitting out your captain for a guy who's going to play 4 minutes. So
If
maybe
I
that means something's
remember
coming, but we'll see.
correctly, didn't Torts, when he coached the Rangers, didn't he sit healthy scratch the captain for the Rangers then too?
I'd have to go back and check, because it's probably a little. It predates the last time a captain
Mhm.
was a healthy scratch, because I believe that was around. I think I saw it, that was 13-14, and Ed Jovanovski, who was more toward the end of his career, and it was kind of
Yeah,
late in the season. It wasn't the same circumstances at all. That's the one thing that I don't understand about
yeah.
this kind of is the timing. You're locked into a playoff race at the time that this starts. There's 14 games left in the season, and you're making an example out of your captain.
Mhm,
Okay, that's an interesting choice. So yeah, and kind of at this point, because I had a buddy text me as the game got started and goes, "So Couturier's out again, scratched
mhm.
again, or whatever." And I said, "Yeah, one game was probably a message. 2 games is teetering that line.
Yeah.
Three, it kind of becomes personal." So I'm very curious if he plays on Saturday, because if he doesn't, it feels personal, and it becomes a scenario where I just don't know where this is supposed to be going.
Mhm. Well, people were saying it, and I saw a lot of posts, a lot of talk about it on Twitter, Instagram, everything, and people were like,
Hmm.
"Torts is gonna Torts." They were like, "There's no explanation that we're probably ever gonna get," and they were like, "Torts is just gonna do what he wants to do," and it sucks on Couturier's end of it because they won against Toronto, and then they played a great game yesterday against Carolina, and then did end up losing in overtime. So it has to be tough from his standpoint to see them playing these successful games after going on a streak where they were not producing offensively and stuff.
I'm sure it does, and he wants to play, especially for how much time he missed. That's the other hard part of it, is that he just wants to play. So it is hard, and I think it's also hard because of the fact that they are where they are too. I like, in addition to the captain angle of it, I don't think we're talking about this if they're not in a playoff race either.
Yeah.
It's like it totally adds to the element of it. It was the same thing with, it was the same thing when the goalie discussion came up a few weeks back too. It's, who cares who the backup is for the Flyers at this point in the season if they're not actively in a playoff race? But those are valuable games, so the backup matters. I think we're doing the same thing, but it's a playoff race, and every game has that feel, and every game, carries that intensity, and the points are valuable, and it just comes across kind of, and I know that people kind of do throw that line out there that this is just torts being torts, and there's an element where that's true. But, you do wonder, for all of the talk, this is what I brought up on the Sports Bash earlier this week with Josh. It was kind of this thing where it's like, you do wonder, after all of the talk at the deadline about this is the reason we didn't do this or did this. And, with Scott Lawton, we're not trading Scott Lawton even for fair value. It's more than fair value we need to get, because that's how much he means to the room. And Nick Seeler gets a contract extension because he's worth it to the room and the culture of the team and all that type of stuff. It just kind of is a little bit of a gamble to say how important that is and then do something like this to your captain. It doesn't mean that he's above everybody else in terms of, if his performance is lacking, there can be a reason to justify this. But it does also feel like if you're going to try to get personal in this situation or turn it into something, it really is interesting that you're doing it to the guy that's higher above in terms of leadership than anybody else on your team.
So we've been talking about the gauntlet of sorts that the Flyers are going through, this 10-game streak they had. So we saw them really struggle with it in the beginning of the series, and they kind of came back, and they finally started to show that fighting effort that you've seen from them in that game against the Bruins, and then that win against Toronto, and then yesterday in Carolina. So they've got a couple hard games left still. They have the Bruins Saturday, Panthers Sunday, and then the Rangers later on that week. How do you see especially these next 3 games coming into play?
I mean, they're at a critical point in this thing, and I give them a lot of credit because, I know it's not going to sound like the prettiest record to say it out loud, but 3-3-1 through 7 of these 10 games is actually pretty good, considering that the entirety of this followed the Sean Walker trade. Nick Seeler was out of the lineup. They've kind of rotated in. You bring in a veteran like Eric Johnson, who's getting used to everything here. You run a defensive pairing that's 2 rookies that barely have NHL experience in Ronnie Attard and Adam Ginning. And I've been very, very impressed by the fact that they've at least been able to hold their own. The first couple of games, it was the positive. Then, it was kind of one extreme than the other. It was an extreme in terms of being really successful, like they were against Florida, and then blown out by, against Tampa, blown out against Toronto. It looked like that was kind of happening with the Boston game a little bit too. Like it got out of hand pretty quickly. And then just like that, they do fight back a little bit. They get nothing to show for it, which is the hard part of the equation. But it does seem like that fight back in that Boston game equated to success against Toronto and success, or gaining a valuable point anyway, against Carolina, and the way they played that third period in particular. So they've kind of gotten it, especially after losing back-to-back games when they lost to Toronto and Boston last week. That kind of set the stage for the potential for everything to go off the rails. And they've kind of pulled it back by gaining points now in 2 straight games and leveling this thing out. It would have been great for them to get that second point against Carolina, being so close to it. When you go to overtime, it's pretty much right there for you. And they had a great scoring chance right before they did get scored on too. So it would have been great for that to happen. You still take the point. You take the fact that you've continued throughout the course of this 2 weeks to get help in the standings from everybody else. Nobody's running with this thing. It's kind of shocking at this point. It really is kind of getting surprising that even, again, just when everybody starts to close in on the thing, like Washington did, they go into play that game against Toronto. It's a 1-point margin. We're talking now about it on Friday, and now it's 3 to 4 points, and there's a chance that it keeps increasing. They gain some points back. There's a chance now that I think it's ironic that this is the way this could go, but they win against the Leafs. They get help from the Leafs the next day because they played Washington and won. They gain a point against Carolina. Would have loved the second one, obviously, but now Carolina goes and plays Washington as well. And there's a chance that you come out of this again at the end of the night, kind of thanking your opponent the night before for doing something that helps you in the long run. And they're getting really close to this point. Like, I think I tried to do some of the math. I'm not the best at this, so forgive me if it's not completely accurate, but based on what I can see, based on the schedule coming up, the Flyers have 3 games left in this gauntlet of 10 games and really the 7 straight against playoff teams. And the Islanders have 2 left. Detroit has 2 left. Washington has 3 left, including the one that they play on Friday night against Carolina. And I believe that at least at this point, the Islanders cannot pass the Flyers by the end of this stretch. They're 6 points back. They only have 2 games to play. The Flyers will get their favorable schedule to come into play before the Islanders would have a chance to even catch them. So that's one team that kind of comes out of the way a little bit. Detroit remains kind of irrelevant if all we're talking about is the Metro. So Washington really is that one team. And if they get no points against Carolina, the same situation applies as the Islanders. It's going to, at the worst, they would be tied. And to be able to kind of actually look at that and see your way through the next 3 games, knowing that you'll still come out of it holding a playoff spot, would be honestly remarkable at this stage of it, to think that you've actually built up enough of a cushion that it would happen with 3 games to go, that you would know that that's your situation. And I don't think that maybe they know it as much. They're probably not focused on it like that, but we all certainly are, because this is what we do. We watch the standings, we watch the scoreboard and all that type of stuff. And they're watching the scoreboard for how these teams are doing, but I'm sure they're doing it all one day at a time. We're looking weeks in advance. So they're closing in on finishing this thing off, and finishing this thing off still being in a playoff spot, which to me was the most critical thing. I've mentioned it several times. I believe I mentioned it when we talked last week, but also I did it on the Sports Bash this week as well. I kind of was hoping for the goal should be 10 points in the 10 games that they played. They're up to 7. So it's achievable. It's right there in front of you, 3 points in 3 games, and you can come out of this thing exactly where I think you need to be pretty close to solidifying your playoff spot, because the schedule does become so favorable for them that if they come out of this with that 10 points in 10 games, I just don't know how they would be able to go about playing a similar way, maybe even getting healthier in the process, and not beating teams like Montreal and Chicago and Columbus and things like that. Like, there are wins that are definitely up for grabs once that schedule gets lighter, if they continue to play with the same style. And if they do, because by that point there's 9 games left in the season, I don't know that they need maybe more than 5 wins over the 9 games, close to 500 again, to solidify their place, because I think everything else will take care of itself as well. These other teams are going to go through the same kind of tough schedule coming up. So I really like their position, and I think that potentially if you can kind of go into these final 3 games feeling that same way, maybe kind of feeling like you're playing with house money, you'll play looser, and you might, maybe you get that win. I would take a lot, especially with the next game, because they've played Boston already within the last week and came close to getting at least a point out of that game. I would take everything that you could take away from that game and continue to apply it, because there's a way. At least it looks like there's a way. The first time they played Boston, it didn't look like there was a way with the way that Boston played. This time it looks like there's a way, and you might be able to come away with at least 1, if not maybe 2 points in that one, to really set the tone for the last 2, because you'd already be close to achieving what I think should be the goal.
We talk a lot about this fighting spirit that they have and how they just keep coming back. One thing, despite having a tough go of it at the beginning of this gauntlet run, the energy of these players and in the locker room seems to have not gone anywhere. I mean, I've seen videos of them in pregame. They still keep this same energy where they're kind of lighthearted yet confident. And you've seen players like Morgan Frost get more confident on the ice, where he's getting more physical and he's making passes he might not have made 3 games into the season. So how important do you think it is for them to keep that energy and that kind of confidence going into the end of this gauntlet, the end of the season, and especially if they get into that playoff spot?
Yeah, and I think it's what's helped the last handful of games too, that you carry some of that confidence in being able to play with these teams. I think that might have been the worry about the way that the first handful of games went, that it was even the one win against San Jose wasn't the greatest, and
Mm-hmm.
2 blowout losses in between. It's like, this shaking your confidence? Is something not right in the room a little bit, that like there's some doubt creeping in, because that can lend to some of the mistakes that are being made. The fight that they had against Boston kind of brought back some of the swagger a little bit. I think they could take some positives out of it. They still needed points, but they could take some positives out of it. And I think that maybe the biggest thing too in this is not so much even just the energy in the room or confidence level, is that as the intensity steps up, the emotion level also increases. You look at, and I'm not trying to say this is out of character for him, but you look at the celebration Scott Lawton has scoring the goal that ultimately is the game winner against Toronto. There's emotion behind every big thing you do,
Mm-hmm.
because it means that much now, and you start to get into that time of year where it's even more it's great that they're meaningful in the first place, but they're even more meaningful when you're in the race and holding one of those spots. And I think they recognize that, and there's a clear desire to finish this thing. I don't doubt that for a second. There's a clear desire for them to finish this off and get into the playoffs. And the last handful of games in particular really show that
Mm-hmm.
they have that energy still about them, that they're not letting it shake things up. And I think that's also kind of to go back to the whole initial topic we were on. That's the kind of concern with the whole Sean Couturier thing, is that why would you do anything to play with that, to mess around with that? The room seems good. Why would you kind of insert a wedge in there? But you are also looking for other guys to step up. And
Mm-hmm.
interestingly enough, you take Couturier out of the lineup. That's about the time that, you see Morgan Frost take this step in confidence and be doing things that you wouldn't expect to see happen on a regular basis. He definitely hasn't tried, he doesn't try to go between the legs every game, but he's done it 2 out of the last 3
Mm-hmm.
now. So clearly he's feeling something that has allowed him to elevate his game a little bit. And, maybe sometimes it's as simple as, because I brought this up also in light of the Couturier thing as well, that Morgan Frost was in this situation where he wasn't getting into the lineup, and it took a
Mm-hmm.
conversation to kind of figure out where everything stood. And he's been one of their best players ever since. That's a really interesting kind of revival of his season. He was kind of in limbo at that point in the season. There was questions about whether or not he was even going to make it through the trade deadline because of how much friction it seemed there was being created between player
Mm-hmm.
and coach. Seems like that's gone now, because you're putting him out there in key situations. He's basically your top line guy at the moment. And then you see that rub off on the other guys who have had those moments in the past as well. You see Owen Tippett starting to get some rhythm back in his game, some consistency back in his game. You see Travis Konechny kind of, for Konechny in particular, because Konechny was struggling so much from the offensive standpoint. He wasn't scoring. I hope that goal at the end of the Carolina game in the third period takes it to another level for him, because this is a time of year where he can be that catalyst. He already has been in situations during the season, but I think this time of year especially can be great for him and can really be a spot where he makes his mark on the team. And I hope that's a stepping stone to building confidence for him. And that as you try to keep these messages kind of going through, when Sean Couturier gets back into the lineup, whenever that may be,
Mm-hmm.
do you run with it? And all of that. So the more guys you can get getting into that, kind of getting that feeling, getting that energy level and confidence level in their game, the better, because it's going to help you beat teams like you have in front of you. And certainly the fact that if you're doing it now against these teams that are in the playoffs, you should definitely be able to do it when you're out of this stretch of games and playing non-playoff teams that are going to give you a fight because they have nothing else to play for, but you should be able to prove you're the better team.
So with these final 3 games of this gauntlet coming up, we are going to be watching very closely and being updated very, very frequently and everything. We will have posts on the 97.3 Instagram and the stories, and there will be pre and post game articles up on 97.3 ESPN. And we'll be back next week to talk about the end of that gauntlet and see how they are going with the end of this season.